In 12C, we're going to talk about the idea of apportionment. That's mainly divvying up resources fairly. So, for example, if you have a whole bunch of teachers in a school district, you can use apportionment to figure out how to divvy them up to all the different schools. Or if a big company like HEB has a lot of employees, they can use apportionment to figure out how to fairly distribute those employees to each of its stores based on how much traffic comes through each store each day. Now, in your textbook, 12C is focusing on how we apportion the seats in the House of Representatives. So there's a little bit of civic background here. So just so you know, our legislative branch is called the Congress, and it's comprised of two houses. There's the Senate and the House of Representatives. According to the Constitution, each state in the United States has exactly two senators, no matter the size of the state. So even though like Texas is big and Maine is small, each state gets two senators. But then there are 435 seats in the House of Representatives, and those get divvied up or apportioned based on the population within that state. So that's the process we're going to focus on. So we had a little discussion here asking about what do you think it means to be fair when you are divvying up those 435 seats in the House among the 50 states? And you probably want to consider the population of the state, right? If a state is small, has a smaller population, they would need less representatives than larger states like New York and California and Texas. And just so you know, the apportionment methods we're going to talk about, they're not 100% perfect. There's no 100% fair way that's going to make everyone happy with a final outcome. But we're going to talk about 4 different methods that have been used throughout our United States history. So just some context in terms of the Constitution. There's only a couple requirements the Constitution sets out. No matter what method is being currently used to apportion seats, the Constitution says each state should get at least 1 seat. So if there's some kind of method, some kind of calculation that's being used that determines a state should get 0 seats, that method is invalid and we can't use it. The only other requirement is that there should not be more than 130 people represented by each representative. Okay. So 1 representative can at most represent, sorry, I said that backwards. At most, for every 30,000 people, there can be at most 1 representative. Now that one person can represent more than 30,000, but that the max, it should not exceed 1 representative for 30,000 people. Okay, so we're going to look at 4 different methods that have been used throughout our history, and each of those methods have 2 calculations, the standard divisor and their standard quota. So these calculations are in all the methods we're going to talk about. So let's talk about the standard divisor first. So the standard divisor is based on the population of the entire country and the number of seats available to divvy up in that country. So those numbers don't change except every 10 years after the census. Then the population of the country might change. But these numbers are pretty set in stone. So once you calculate this divisor, it's going to get used over and over and over again. So let's find the standard divisor for the United States. So after the last census in 2010, there were approximately 309 million people in the total population of the United States. So the total population of the country right now is approximately according to the last census 10 years ago, is 309 million. And right now, we currently have 435 seats available. Now, that number is not built into the Constitution. That number changes over time, but that's what we currently have in the United States. There's 435 seats available. So when I divide these 2 numbers, that's going to give us what we call the standard divisor. That's going to be the divisor that we use in all of our calculations. So that number comes out to be 710,300. If I round to the nearest number, that'd be 345. Okay, so each of those 435 representatives, in theory, should represent about 700,000 people. So the other number we're going to need in our calculations is called the standard quota. And that's going to change from state to state because it's based on the state population. it's still going to use that standard divisor based on the country population and the number of seats for the whole country. So that number doesn't change, but the state population, it's going to change from state to state. So let's find the standard quota. That means the ideal number of seats that should be given to Texas. So according to the 2010 census, there were about 25,146,100 people. That's the population in the whole state of Texas. And our standard divisor that we just calculated for the entire country was 710,345 is the standard divisor. So when I divide that, just typing it in my calculator and dividing that, I get 35.4. So that means Texas should get 35.4 seats. But you can't have 4/10 of a seat. That's not going to happen. So either Texas is going to end up with 35 seats or Texas is going to end up with 36 seats. And the way we decide that depends on the method we're using. Now, Texas definitely wants us to get 36 seats. Every seat gives Texas a little bit more power and a little bit more pull in our legislative system. But there might be some methods that say, no, Texas only should get 35 seats. So let's look at some of those methods. Okay, now here's the deal. We're not going to look at these methods through the lens of the entire United States. I mean, a population of 309 million and 50 different states to divvy up seats to, that's too much. So what we're going to do for learning purposes is create a fictional country. So this fictional country is going to have 100,000 people and it's going to have 100 seats to divvy up. So when I go to find that standard divisor, that's the number we're going to divide by over and over and over again. It's going to be based on 100,000 people, that's the population, and 100 seats. So when I divide that, my standard divisor that I'm going to use over and over and over again is going to be 1,000. And that doesn't change because it was based on numbers for the entire country that only change every 10 years. Now we're going to go through and find that standard quota for each individual state based on the state population and that divisor that we just calculated. So in this fictional country, like I said, there's a total population of 100,000, but I've divided that population up between 4 different states. And there's going to be a small state. State A is pretty small. State B and State C are much larger, and they're pretty similar in population. And then State D is the largest in this fictional country. So I'm going to take each of those populations, and I'm going to divide by that standard divisor we calculated using the population of the whole country and the number of seats in that country. So when I do that, I'm going to get this decimal number. And we'll talk about what to do with that in a minute. But let's do these these calculations for all the other states. When I divide by 1,000, I'm just moving the decimal place, the replace values to the right. So it's pretty easy to divide these without a calculator. So I'm just getting these decimal numbers. 37.35. Okay. And then the minimum number of seats that State A should get is 9. It might get 10. We might decide to round up based on our method, but we don't know. Right now, we're just going to round these down. Okay. But when I add those up, it's only adding up to 99 seats. There's supposed to be 100. So that means there's 1 extra seat floating around. So how do we decide who gets that extra seat? Some people might argue that the extra seat should go to the smallest state because they might need more representation. But then other people might argue, hey, that extra seat should go to the largest state because they have more people. They should get more representation. And that's what we're going to talk about, like how to fairly divvy up that extra seat using 4 different methods that we've used throughout history. So let's jump into what these methods are going to look like. We're going to start off with Hamilton's method. So we're using that same fictional country. I see a little typo here. That should be 100 seats and the divisor of 1,000, just like we calculated. Fictional country of 100,000 people, 100 seats to give out. So we calculated a standard divisor of 1,000. So we're going to use that over and over again. I have this same 4 states from the previous problem. So we have those same 4 decimal numbers that got rounded down. Okay. And we're going to talk about how Hamilton Alexander Hamilton, how Hamilton decided that extra seat should get assigned. So what Hamilton did was he said, okay, let's just look at the fractional remainder. That's that decimal part. When you subtract off the whole number, what's left over? And he said, whoever has the biggest fractional remainder should get that extra seat. So when I look at all these fractional remainders, and those should add up to 1 since there's 1 extra seat, but just approximate, because there might be some rounding there. When we look at those, we see that in this case, state A has the largest fractional remainder. So state A, according to Hamilton's method, would get that extra seat. It would end up with 10 seats. And state B would stay at 27 seats. Going to erase those lines so we don't get confused. And then state C would stay at 26 seats, and state D would stay at 37, and that adds up to 100. So all 100 seats would get assigned, and state A is super happy right now because they got an extra seat. But state D is kind of miffed because look how close their state D's fractional remainder was to state A's fractional remainder. I mean, and state A has more people. Shouldn't they get the seat? So these processes become very politically charged, and they've changed over time. We do not use Hamilton's method anymore. The reason why we don't use Hamilton's method, though, is because some paradoxes started popping up over time. There is 3 different paradoxes that your book goes into. I'm not going to go into detail on these. You can read about it in your book if you want. It's just for some historical context why we don't use Hamilton's method any longer. But a lot of the reasons why we change our method is just for purely political reasons. These mathematical reasons came up later when people started analyzing the different methods. Different mathematicians and statisticians wanted to look deeper into it. Usually we change for political reasons. Okay, so Hamilton's method, just to recap, when there's an extra seat, Hamilton hands it out. That's how I remember this. I think Hamilton has an H, and Hamilton is going to hand out the extra seat. So they hand out extra seat to the highest remainder. The highest remainder. Okay, so that is Hamilton. Let's move on to the Jefferson method.